A gasp tore from my lungs, the phantom agony of metal shearing against metal, of shattering glass still echoing through me. My body remembered the brutal impact, the sickening lurch before darkness. But I wasn't in a mangled car or a hospital. Sunlight, buttery and warm, streamed through the familiar lace curtains of my childhood canopy bed. The scent of my mother's peace roses, roses my stepmother, Lydia, would later rip out with a dismissive wave of her manicured hand, drifted from the open window. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ice. It was the morning of my 16th birthday, 5 years. I was 5 years in the past, 5 years before Lydia's loyal chauffeur, under her explicit orders, ran my car off the Mulholland Overlook. 5 years before she'd finally succeeded in murdering me for my inheritance. Downstairs, the clink of china and Lydia's bright, false laughter floated up. The sound, once a normal part of my mornings, now scraped against my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. Dread, cold and heavy, settled in my stomach. This wasn't just a dream, this was a chilling, impossible second chance. Lydia was already in the dining room, a vision in a silk morning gown the color of expensive champagne. She turned as I entered, her smile perfectly sculpted. Her eyes, the eyes of my murderer, glinting with something I hadn't recognized then, but saw with horrifying clarity now, avarice. "There's my birthday girl," she cooed, her voice dripping with a sweetness that made my teeth ache. A lavish breakfast was spread out, Belgian waffles, fresh berries, eggs Benedict, an excessive display even for a birthday. And, beside my plate, a mountain of exquisitely wrapped gifts. This was all the same, a horrifying echo of that long-ago morning. But then, the first deviation. She presented a flat, velvet box, larger than the one I remembered. Not the simple, heart-shaped silver locket my father had given my mother, the one Lydia had found for me that first time, a poignant, painful reminder. No. Inside this box, nestled on a bed of satin, lay an ostentatious diamond necklace, heavy and cold. It glittered with a vulgar brilliance, a stark contrast to the delicate locket I had cherished until my dying breath. "For my beautiful stepdaughter," Lydia purred, fastening it around my neck before I could react. The diamonds felt like ice against my skin. "A young lady of your standing needs to shine." Her words, her touch, were a fresh betrayal laid upon an old, still festering wound. This was her opening gambit, I realized with a sickening lurch. In my first life, I'd been too naive to see it. The expensive, unsuitable gift wasn't generosity. It was the first brushstroke in her portrait of me as a frivolous spendthrift heiress, incapable of managing her own affairs. A justification for her later, more drastic interventions. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "We need to ensure your future is well managed, Delara." As she spoke, the elegant dining room seemed to waver, replaced by a stark, chilling memory. I was 19 again, frail and weak in a sterile hospital bed. Lydia sat beside me, her expression one of perfectly feigned concern, the scent of her cloying perfume, the same she wore today, filling my senses. "The doctor's bills are astronomical, darling," her past self had murmured, her voice smooth as poisoned silk. "And those unfortunate investments Mr. Henderson advised you on? Well, they haven't performed as hoped." Lies, all lies. The illness that had weakened me, I now knew, was no accident of fate but a slow, deliberate poisoning. The unfortunate investments were her carefully orchestrated schemes to drain my accounts. I saw again the stack of documents she'd placed before me, her manicured finger guiding my trembling hand to sign. Forged signatures, legal jargon I was too ill and grief-stricken to comprehend. She'd explained it was all to protect me, to simplify things. I remembered the cold smirk that had finally broken through her mask of sympathy as she'd taken the signed papers. Papers that stripped me of my father's legacy, my birthright. And then, weeks later, the accident. The terror, the pain, the final, crushing realization of her ultimate betrayal. The memory receded, leaving me back at the breakfast table, the heavy diamonds cold against my throat. The bitterness of that past life was a physical ache in my chest, so profound it almost buckled me. But this time, the despair was edged with something new, an icy, diamond-hard resolve. Later, alone in my sun-drenched bedroom, I stared at my reflection. The face looking back was younger, softer, untouched by the horrors I remembered. But the eyes, my eyes were different. They held the chilling knowledge of a woman who had been to hell and back. They held the memory of betrayal and death. I unclasped the ostentatious necklace, its weight an unwelcome burden. In my first life, I would have cried over this unwanted, showy gift, confused by its inappropriateness, hurt by the absence of the locket I'd secretly hoped for. Now, I examined it with cold detachment. An almost invisible maker's mark was etched near the clasp, a detail I'd never have noticed before. Van Corp Jewelers. Lydia's preferred fence for disposing of unwanted family heirlooms from her previous, less fortunate marriages, if my resurrected memories served me correctly. Every detail mattered now. I would not be her victim. Not again. A voice, quiet but unshakable, resonated deep within me. This time, Lydia, the game is mine, and you won't even see me coming. That evening, at the small family dinner Lydia arranged, the next piece of her familiar script fell into place. Between polite sips of champagne, which I only pretended to drink, she made her announcement. "Elara, darling," she began, her smile radiating false maternal concern, "with you turning 16 and with such a considerable inheritance to think about one day, I've taken the liberty of engaging a new financial advisor to help manage your portfolio, a Mr. Henderson. He comes highly recommended. A Mr. Henderson, the same sycophantic, spineless man who had rubber-stamped every one of Lydia's fraudulent transactions in my past life, the architect of my financial ruin, all while lining his own pockets." My insides went cold, but I kept my expression placid. In my first life, I had mumbled a hesitant, intimidated agreement. I had trusted. I had been a lamb to the slaughter. This time, a different Elara answered. I offered Lydia a small, sweet smile. "That's very thoughtful of you, Lydia." Her own smile widened, triumphant. "But Father always said it was important for me to understand finances myself. He believed a woman should be mistress of her own fortune, not dependent on others." I paused, letting that sink in. Perhaps Mr. Henderson could tutor me directly. I'd be very keen to learn. The surprise that flickered across Lydia's face was instantaneous and deeply satisfying. Her smile tightened just a fraction, but I saw it. My calm, direct request, so out of character for the timid girl she remembered and expected, was the first pebble dropped into the smooth surface of her scheme. She recovered quickly, of course. "Why, Elara, what a surprisingly proactive idea." Her tone was still patronizing, but a new, uncertain light danced in her eyes. "We can certainly discuss that." But I had seen it. The flicker of imbalance. The game had indeed begun. And this time, I knew all the rules, and she didn't even know she was playing against a seasoned opponent. My new life settled into a strange rhythm, a delicate dance of feigned innocence and sharp-eyed observation. I became the perfect stepdaughter, a phantom limb of obedience Lydia hadn't realized she'd lost and then regained. I accompanied her to mind-numbing charity luncheons where the clatter of jewelry was louder than the conversation. I fetched her cashmere wrap when the air conditioning was too high, nodded vaguely when she spoke of market trends she clearly didn't understand, and smiled demurely at her vapid friends whose names I now meticulously catalogued. Their insincere compliments on my newfound maturity, read passivity, were almost laughable. All the while, my mind was a whirring engine, recording every detail. Lydia's increasingly reckless spending habits, the sycophants who clung to her, the subtle ways she manipulated conversations to paint herself as a long-suffering saint burdened with a flighty stepdaughter. The scent of her expensive French perfume, Jardin Interdit, Forbidden Garden, seemed to precede her like a warning signal, a constant reminder of her duplicity. One afternoon, while ostensibly reading in the conservatory, I overheard her on the phone, her voice honeyed but laced with venom. "Honestly, Marjorie, the girl is sweet, but utterly clueless about the value of money. If I weren't here to guide her, well, the vultures would descend. It's a constant worry." The words were almost identical to the justifications she'd used with lawyers in my past life, paving the way for her to seize control. My grip tightened on the book, the pages crinkling. Outwardly, if she'd glanced over, she would have seen only a girl engrossed in a novel. Inwardly, I filed away her exact phrasing, the practiced tremor in her voice, another piece of evidence in the growing case against her. Lydia, emboldened by my seemingly unwavering compliance, grew more confident, her arrogance swelling like a poorly baked souffle. She began to make small yet significant changes around the estate, erasing more of my father's and by extension my mother's legacy. The most painful was the dismissal of Mrs. Gable, our housekeeper since I was a baby. Mrs. Gable, with her kind eyes and warm, flower-dusted hands, had been the closest thing to a mother I'd had after my own passed. In my first life, she'd tried to warn me about Lydia, her concerns dismissed as the ramblings of an overprotective servant. Lydia had fired her then too. This time, Lydia delivered the news with a dismissive wave. She was getting far too familiar, Alara dear, and frankly, a bit past her prime. It's for the best, really. We need staff who are more aligned with our current needs. She patted my hand, her rings cold against my skin, clearly believing I was too timid, too cowed to object. Don't you worry your pretty little head about it. A lump formed in my throat. I wanted to scream, to rage, but I offered only a small, sad nod, a flicker of disappointment in my eyes that Lydia would interpret as resignation. Oh, I'll miss her scones, I said softly. But that night, under the guise of retrieving a forgotten textbook, I slipped into the small office where household records were kept. Lydia's new, impeccably organized filing system was no match for a girl who knew exactly what she was looking for. I found Mrs. Gable's forwarding address and tucked it away. A potential ally was a precious commodity. A few weeks later, my carefully constructed facade of disinterest paid off. I was passing my late father's study, the door slightly ajar. The low murmur of voices, Lydia's and Mr. Henderson's, drifted out. This was the room where my disinheritance had been sealed, a place I usually avoided. Its dark wood paneling and the scent of old leather and lingering cigar smoke, my father's, a constant, painful reminder. Today, however, a strange compulsion drew me closer. Absolutely secure, Lydia, Henderson was saying, his voice unctuous and low. The Cayman accounts are untraceable, and the Langley Trust is perfect for, I accidentally pushed the door further open, a surprised, "Oh," on my lips. "I'm so sorry. I was just looking for—" I let my voice trail off, feigning embarrassment. Lydia and Henderson sprang apart like guilty teenagers, papers shuffling hastily. Henderson's face was flushed, his eyes shifty. Lydia, however, recovered instantly, her smile a little too bright. "Alara, darling, we were just organizing some of your father's outdated estate matters. Terribly dull, nothing for you to worry about." My gaze flickered over the desk, seemingly taking in the clutter. But my eyes, sharp and trained by past betrayals, caught a glimpse of a familiar letterhead amongst the documents Henderson was trying to cover. The distinctive logo of Viridian Holdings, the primary shell corporation Lydia had used to siphon millions from my inheritance in my first life. The air crackled with the unspoken. They were replaying their old script, page by page, utterly unaware that their audience was no longer naive, but a critic who knew every line by heart. I feigned disinterest, my gaze drifting to the large, imposing portrait of my father above the fireplace. "It still smells like his cigars in here sometimes," I said wistfully, then gave a little sigh. "Well, I won't disturb your organizing." My tutoring sessions with Mr. Henderson began the following week. They were, as expected, a farce. He treated me like a child, explaining basic financial concepts with exaggerated patience, clearly under instructions from Lydia to keep me occupied but unenlightened. I played my part perfectly, asking seemingly innocent, rambling questions I claimed to have read about in a teen magazine. "Mr. Henderson," I'd ask, twirling a pen, "what are these offshore accounts? Are they like pirate treasure hidden on islands?" He would chuckle condescendingly. "Not quite, Miss Alara. They are merely complex financial instruments for sophisticated investors." "Oh," I'd say, widening my eyes. "And these bearer bonds I saw mentioned in that spy movie? Can anyone just cash them in? I watched him squirm under the guise of my childish curiosity, his evasive answers, the slight sheen of sweat on his upper lip when I mentioned specific types of investments I knew Lydia favored, all confirming my memories. He was a weak man, easily flustered and pathetically eager to please his wealthy benefactress. After each session, I returned to my room and, on a new, heavily encrypted laptop, purchased with funds from a small savings bond my maternal grandmother had left me, a bond Lydia had overlooked in both lives, I meticulously documented his unease, his half-truths, Lydia's patterns. I cross-referenced dates, amounts, and her known associates from my past life, creating a digital breadcrumb trail, a silent, growing dossier of their impending crimes. The first real test of my ability to subtly influence events came sooner than I expected. Lydia, ever impatient, began to set the stage for one of her early, smaller, fraudulent schemes. Investing a chunk of my trust fund into a sham beachfront property development pitched by a notoriously slippery con artist named Julian Vance, a charming acquaintance of hers. In my first life, this deal had tanked spectacularly, costing me a significant sum and further cementing Lydia's narrative of my financial incompetence. I remembered the timeline, the specific newspaper Vance often used to boast about his non-existent successes. 2 days before Lydia was due to meet Vance to discuss the exciting prospectus, I typed a carefully worded anonymous letter. It contained no accusations, only verifiable, damning facts about Vance's previously failed ventures and outstanding lawsuits in other states, complete with case numbers. I printed it at a public library, wore gloves to handle it, and mailed it to a well-known, notoriously aggressive gossip columnist with a penchant for exposing social climbers and their dodgy dealings. I even included a tip that Vance was currently targeting vulnerable, wealthy widows and heiresses in the hills. A week later, as Lydia was preparing for a luncheon where she intended to subtly boast about her astute upcoming investment, the column appeared. It didn't name Lydia, of course, but it painted a devastating portrait of Julian Vance, the coastal Casanova of questionable concrete. It detailed his trail of financial destruction with gleeful precision. I watched Lydia read it over her morning coffee, her cup clattering against the saucer as her face paled. Her planned meeting with Vance was, I later heard her furiously whisper into the phone, indefinitely postponed due to unforeseen due diligence complications. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips as I buttered my toast. This minor disruption was my first covert strike, a satisfying ripple in her carefully laid plans. It wouldn't stop her, not yet. But it was a start. Her flicker of visible annoyance, the tightening of her lips as she read the scathing article, was a small taste of the confusion and frustration I intended to serve her, dish by cold dish. The game was truly afoot, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, a tiny spark of grim satisfaction warmed the icy core of my resolve. Lydia's annoyance over the delayed Vance deal soon found a new, more personal outlet. A few weeks later, she approached me in the sunroom, her expression a careful blend of sympathy and regret. The scent of lilies, funereal and cloying, filled the air from a massive bouquet she'd had delivered, a subtle, morbid touch I now recognized as part of her stagecraft. "Elara, darling," she began, her voice soft, "I'm afraid I have some rather unfortunate news." I set down my book, my heart giving a small, painful thud. I knew this play. I knew every line. "It seems there's a minor liquidity issue with the estate finances at the moment," she continued, smoothly glossing over the fact that her extravagant spending was the sole cause. "Nothing to truly worry about in the long term, of course, but in the short term, we need to free up some capital." She paused, her gaze flicking towards the window, towards the distant, hazy outline of the hills. "Therefore, I've had to make a difficult decision. We need to sell the little cottage by Mirror Lake." The cottage, my mother's cottage, it wasn't grand, not like the main house. It was small, rustic, filled with the scent of pine needles and old books. It was where my mother had painted, where she'd taught me to identify wildflowers, where her laughter still seemed to echo in the sun-dappled rooms. In my first life, its loss had been a devastating blow, a severing of one of my last tangible links to her. Lydia had sold it for a pittance to one of her cronies, who'd promptly torn it down to build a soulless glass monstrosity. The memory was a fresh stab of pain. Lydia was watching me, her expression carefully neutral, but I saw the predatory gleam deep in her eyes. She expected tears, protests, a display of sentimental weakness she could easily override. She produced a sheaf of papers from a leather satchel. It's a good offer, Alara, from a very motivated buyer. It will resolve our temporary difficulties quite neatly. I just need your signature here, a mere formality, as you're technically a part owner, though, of course, as your guardian. She let the implication hang in the air. The documents felt heavy in my hand, the cheap paper a stark contrast to the priceless memories the cottage held. This was more than just a financial transaction. It was an act of calculated cruelty, designed to further isolate and demoralize me. I allowed a tremor to enter my voice, my eyes welling with tears. Some genuine for the memory of my mother and the violation of her sanctuary, but most, a carefully crafted performance. The lake cottage. Oh, Lydia, are you sure? It meant so much to Mama. I know, dear, I know, she said, her voice dripping with false empathy as she reached out to pat my arm. Her touch felt like a spider's. It's terribly sad, but sometimes we must make practical decisions, however painful. It's for the good of the estate, Alara, your future. I looked down at the papers, feigning a struggle. If it must be done, I whispered, my voice thick with manufactured grief. If it's truly necessary, for the estate, then I understand. I gave a little sniffle, dabbing at my eyes with the back of my hand like a lost child. Lydia's internal sigh of relief was almost audible. She was getting exactly what she wanted, a show of resistance, easily overcome, reinforcing her narrative of my emotional immaturity and her own sensible stewardship. I'll look them over tonight, I managed, clutching the documents to my chest, and sign them in the morning. That's my brave girl, she said, her smile now victorious. She was already mentally spending the proceeds, I could tell. A new sports car, perhaps? Or another obscenely expensive piece of jewelry. The thought fueled the cold fire in my veins. That night, the house was silent, Lydia off to some charity gala where she would no doubt subtly boast of her astute property management. In my room, the only light came from the glow of my laptop screen. The documents for the sale of the cottage lay on my desk untouched. I wouldn't be signing them. Instead, I was diving deep into the digital archives of the County Planning Commission and the State Historical Preservation Office. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the advanced coding skills I'd secretly, obsessively cultivated in this new life, a direct result of the helpless rage I'd felt at my past disempowerment, now my sharpest weapon. I knew from my past life that Lydia's buyer, a sleazy developer associate of hers named Marcus Thorne, planned a quick demolition and rebuild, relying on an overlooked zoning loophole and the assumption that no one would care about a dilapidated old cabin. He was wrong. I meticulously compiled a dossier, scanned archival photographs of my mother at the cottage, diary entries, hers which I'd preserved, describing its unique construction by a local artisan in the early 1900s, its connection to a minor regional artist movement, even soil samples from the surrounding protected wetlands that I'd innocently collected on a walk there weeks ago, knowing this day might come. Then, using an anonymized IP address and a temporary encrypted email, I drafted and submitted a comprehensive, legally sound, and entirely valid historical preservation nomination for the Mirror Lake Artisan Cottage and associated protected wetlands. I cited specific statutes, highlighted unique architectural features, and emphasized its cultural significance to the local community, a community Lydia had always disdained. The soft click of the submit button echoed in the quiet room. It was a declaration of war, silent and unseen, but deeply, deeply satisfying. The cottage wouldn't just be saved, it would be encased in so much bureaucratic red tape that Thorne wouldn't be able to lay a single brick on it for years, if ever. Weeks later, Lydia hosted one of her lavish garden parties. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns, the air filled with the scent of roses. Her roses, not my mother's. and the murmur of polite, vacuous conversation. Lydia was in her element, gliding between groups of her socialite friends, subtly boasting about her savvy handling of some complex estate matters. I watched from the periphery, sipping lemonade, the picture of demure innocence. Then, her jewel-encrusted mobile phone, resting on a nearby table, trilled imperiously. She picked it up with a practiced smile, expecting a call from her caterer or perhaps another fawning admirer. I saw the exact moment the news hit her. Her smile froze, then cracked. Her perfectly made-up face drained of color, leaving her looking suddenly older, harsher. Her voice, initially low and purring, became shrill. "What do you mean, unexpected complications?" She hissed into the phone, her eyes darting around as if seeking an immediate target for her fury. "A heritage claim? Don't be ridiculous. That shack is worthless. Who would possibly—" Her gaze swept across the lawn, her carefully curated composure shattering like fragile glass. Several of her guests exchanged curious, knowing glances. The sale of the cottage, her quick infusion of cash, had just collapsed. The lucrative deal was dead, drowned in a sea of unforeseen legal complexities. Later that evening, after the last of the unnerved guests had departed, Lydia confronted me. Her face was a mask of fury, her voice tight with suspicion. "That heritage claim on the cottage," she said, her words clipped. "Did you have anything to do with this, Alara?" I looked up from my book, my eyes wide with carefully feigned innocence and concern. I clutched a silk handkerchief, a prop I'd learned Lydia associated with my moments of emotional distress. "A heritage claim?" I repeated, my brow furrowed. "Oh, Lydia, that sounds terribly complicated. Is the cottage, is it really that old and important? I had no idea." I allowed a little quaver into my voice. "Does this mean it won't be sold after all?" My feigned hopefulness was, I thought, a particularly nice touch. My performance of bewildered ignorance clearly threw her. She stared at me, searching for any sign of duplicity, but found only the familiar image of the naive, slightly dim-witted girl she thought she controlled. She let out an exasperated sigh, running a hand through her perfectly coiffed hair, dislodging a few strands. "It means," she snapped, "that things are going to be significantly more irritating." She was left fuming, unable to pinpoint the source of her setback, her first real taste of financial disruption leaving her visibly rattled and deeply suspicious. But not of me. Not yet. The power dynamic, I knew with a surge of cold triumph, had subtly, deliciously begun to shift. The first silent revenge loop was complete, and it felt like justice. The collapse of the cottage sale sent ripples through Lydia's carefully constructed financial world. Her extravagant spending, predicated on a constant influx of easily accessible cash from my estate, suddenly faced an unwelcome drought. The previously minor liquidity issue was rapidly becoming a genuine problem for her. Her charm began to fray at the edges, replaced by a brittle tension that vibrated beneath her Chanel suits. She found me in the library one afternoon, the scent of her perfume sharper, less inviting than usual, almost acrid. "Alara," she said, her voice tight, "we need to discuss the Atherton Trust." This was a smaller but still substantial trust fund my father had set up with stricter access clauses, requiring my direct consent for any significant withdrawals. Given the unforeseen delays with other assets, I think it would be prudent to release some capital from it, just to tide things over. She placed a new set of documents before me, her smile strained. "Mr. Henderson has prepared the paperwork. A simple signature from you is all that's needed." I looked at the papers, then up at her, my expression one of mild, polite confusion. "But Lydia," I said softly, "Father's instructions for the Atherton Trust were very specific. He wrote a letter about it, remember? He said it was for my education and future security, to be touched only in direst emergency." I paused, as if searching my memory. I found his letter in his desk a while ago. He said I should always be consulted and truly understand any use of those funds. Lydia's jaw tightened. I knew she remembered the letter. She had tried to make it disappear in my first life. My finding it now was a deliberate, calculated move. "Don't be difficult, Alara," she snapped, her veneer of patience cracking. "This is an emergency, a temporary one, but still." When I didn't immediately acquiesce, her tone turned saccharine yet laced with steel. You wouldn't want to be seen as ungrateful, would you? Or deliberately obstructive to the smooth running of your own financial affairs? Over the next few days, I overheard her on the phone with various distant relatives, her voice dripping with carefully crafted concern about my sudden willfulness and lack of understanding about practical matters. She was trying to isolate me, to paint me as problematic, just as she had before, but this time her whispers were falling on ears I was already subtly preparing. Her next move was predictable, a tactic straight from her old playbook. About a week later, Mr. Albright, our elderly and deeply principled family lawyer, a man Lydia privately loathed but publicly deferred to due to his long association with my father, requested a meeting with both of us. In his dusty, book-lined office, the air smelling of old paper and integrity, Lydia adopted a somber expression. "Mr. Albright," she began, dabbing at a non-existent tear, "it is with a heavy heart that I must bring this to your attention." She produced a slim, leather-bound diary, its pages filled with a spidery, childish scrawl. I I found Alara's diary, and some of the entries, well, they are deeply troubling. They speak of resentment, of reckless spending desires, a complete lack of appreciation for her position. My heart gave a small, cold thump, not of fear, but of grim anticipation. I recognized the diary. It was a forgery, of course, just like the one she'd produced in my first life to try and prove my incompetence. Mr. Albright took the diary, his expression unreadable as he slowly turned the pages. Lydia watched him, a small, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. When he finally looked up, however, it was not at Lydia he frowned, but at the diary itself. "This is rather melodramatic, wouldn't you say, Lydia?" he said, his voice dry. He then turned to me. "Alara, my dear, when you came to see me a few weeks ago, expressing your concerns about your stepmother's recent erratic behavior and her sometimes confusing financial suggestions, you showed me your personal journal, did you not?" I nodded, meeting his gaze steadily. "Yes, Mr. Albright." "And it was, if I recall," he continued, his eyes twinkling faintly, "a rather more thoughtful and mature record of a young lady conscientiously trying to understand her responsibilities, including detailed notes on our discussions about your father's estate wishes." He turned back to Lydia, his expression hardening. "This document, however," he tapped the fake diary, "bears little resemblance to the intelligent, responsible young woman I've come to know. In fact, Lydia, given your recent attempts to pressure Alara regarding the Atherton Trust against her late father's explicit written desires, this feels less like a concerned guardian and more like a rather clumsy attempt at manipulation." Lydia's face went from triumphant to aghast, then to a mottled, furious red. Her meticulously planned character assassination had spectacularly backfired. Mr. Albright, now thoroughly suspicious of her motives, effectively became my staunchest public defender, vowing to oversee all aspects of my inheritance with renewed vigilance. Lydia had not only failed to discredit me, but had solidified my position and inadvertently painted herself as the untrustworthy party. Alone in my room that night, I allowed myself a small, grim smile. I spread out my notes, the complex web of my counteroffensive. Anonymous tips to regulatory bodies about Lydia's shadier associates were already in motion. Timed information releases designed to subtly disrupt her cash flow and sow discord among her allies were scheduled. It was a multi-layered strategy, intricate and demanding. There was a cold satisfaction in each successful maneuver, each piece falling into place. But there were moments, too, of profound weariness. The constant vigilance, the mask of innocence I had to wear every day, the crushing isolation of my reborn knowledge, it was an exhausting existence. Sometimes the sheer weight of it all threatened to overwhelm me. In those moments, I would look at the small, faded photograph of my mother I kept hidden in my actual journal. Her smiling face, so full of life and love, reminded me of what Lydia had stolen, not just from me, but from her memory, too. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming a stolen life, a desecrated legacy. It was about justice. The brief wave of exhaustion would recede, replaced by a renewed, steely resolve. Lydia, however, was far from defeated. Her desperation, fueled by mounting debts and thwarted plans, only made her more reckless. She accelerated her grandest, most audacious scheme from my past life to leverage a significant portion of my remaining inheritance, which she clearly believed she could now access only through outright fraud, to invest in a high-risk speculative tech startup. The startup, NovaGen Innovations, was run by a charming, silver-tongued fraudster named Damien Trent, a man Lydia had recently begun seeing, her eyes lit with a disturbing combination of avarice and something that looked suspiciously like infatuation. I remembered Damien well. His empty promises and flashy presentations had been instrumental in Lydia's previous ruin of my finances. One evening, I overheard her on the phone with him, her voice giddy, almost girlish. Absolutely revolutionary, Damien. A guaranteed 500% return within the year. Once Alara's funds are transferred, we'll be set for life. She won't suspect a thing. I have a new power of attorney document Mr. Henderson found amongst her father's papers. Perfectly legal, she'll just have to accept it. The casual mention of the forged power of attorney sent a chill down my spine, even though I'd anticipated it. The sheer audacity of her self-deception was breathtaking. She was so convinced of her own cleverness, so dismissive of my intelligence, that she was walking blindly into the very trap I'd spent months preparing. Weeks earlier, armed with my foreknowledge of Damien Trent's fraudulent company and Lydia's inevitable involvement, I had set my own, more complex plan in motion. Using a series of untraceable communications and sophisticated, anonymously sourced data packets, I had begun feeding meticulously falsified yet utterly plausible, swagged, leaked due diligence reports to a rival, genuinely ruthless but legitimate venture capital firm, Apex Capital. These reports hinted at NovaGen's imminent breakthrough in a fictitious cutting-edge technology, subtly suggesting that a naive private heiress, Lydia using my money, was about to secure an exclusive, massively undervalued stake. I knew Apex Capital's aggressive reputation. They wouldn't be able to resist the lure of scooping what they believed was a hidden gem from an unsuspecting competitor. The day Lydia, brimming with confidence, sat down with Mr. Henderson and Damien Trent to sign the final transfer documents that would funnel millions of my inheritance into NovaGen's coffers, my trap was sprung. Just as Trent was sliding the signatory page towards Lydia, his phone buzzed. Then Henderson's, then Lydia's. A flurry of urgent messages. The news hit them like a synchronized shockwave. Apex Capital, acting on credible intelligence of an undervalued asset and imminent hostile takeover potential, had launched an aggressive, legally sound, and very public preliminary takeover bid for NovaGen Innovations. Their initial probing had immediately exposed the company's shaky foundations, its non-existent patents, and Trent's history of shell corporations. Within hours, NovaGen's assets were frozen pending investigation. Trent's charming facade crumbled, revealing the desperate con man beneath. The millions Lydia had been about to sign away vanished not into her control, but into a legal and financial maelstrom. She stared at the now worthless documents in her hand, her face a mask of stunned disbelief and dawning horror. Her grand scheme, her ticket to ultimate wealth, had not only evaporated, but had also dragged her chosen fraudster, and by association her own judgment, into the glaring, unforgiving spotlight of a major financial scandal. The silence in the opulent meeting room was broken only by Lydia's ragged breathing. She had walked right into my web, and the strands were tightening. The spectacular implosion of the NovaGen deal, with Damien Trent now facing serious fraud charges, sent Lydia into a tailspin. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling, her access to my funds choked off at every turn. Yet even amidst the wreckage of her schemes, a core of her arrogant self-assurance remained. She still believed she had one final unassailable ace up her sleeve. That ace was the upcoming annual shareholder meeting for my late father's original, now smaller, but still strategically valuable holding company, Sterling Enterprises. It was the bedrock of our family's wealth, and Lydia had been steadily, almost obsessively, acquiring proxy votes from minor disgruntled shareholders for years, even before my rebirth. She was convinced that with her current collection of proxies, she finally had enough to oust the loyalist board members, men who had served my father faithfully, and install her own puppets. This, she believed, would grant her unfettered legal control over the company's remaining assets. The formal notification for the meeting arrived by courier. I watched as Lydia read it, a slow, smug smile spreading across her face, chasing away some of the haggard lines of stress that had recently appeared. The scent of her perfume, Jardin Interdit, seemed to reassert itself, a little stronger, a little more confident. Just a few, formalities, Elara dear, she said, her voice regaining some of its old condescending silkiness. She waved the notice at me. To ensure your future and the family legacy are finally managed with proper vision. The dramatic irony was so thick, I could have spread it on toast. She was walking into the grand finale of her own downfall, utterly oblivious. The day of the meeting dawned gray and overcast, mirroring the mood, or so Lydia thought, of the current Sterling Enterprises board. We arrived at the imposing, granite-faced building downtown. The boardroom was cavernous, dominated by a long, polished mahogany table that reflected the grim faces of the existing board members like a dark mirror. Lydia, however, was a picture of confident radiance in a power-red suit. She was flanked by the ever-present, though visibly nervous, Mr. Henderson, and a couple of her more grasping, sycophantic allies, their faces alight with greedy anticipation. She greeted the old board members with a smile that was all teeth. I took my seat quietly at the far end of the table, seemingly insignificant, a mere teenage observer dragged along to witness her stepmother's triumph. I could feel Lydia's occasional dismissive glances, my apparent passivity clearly fueling her confidence. The meeting began with the usual dry recitations of last year's minutes and financial reports. Then the chairman, Mr. Carmichael, a man with kind eyes who had known my father since university, his voice heavy, moved to the main agenda, the vote for control of the board. Lydia leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. This was her moment. She made a poised, confident speech, her voice resonating with false sincerity, about the need for new directions, for dynamic leadership to revitalize a stagnating portfolio, and for protecting the interests of the primary beneficiary, meaning me, though her version of protection was akin to a wolf guarding a lamb. When she finished, she presented her stack of proxy votes to Mr. Carmichael with a flourish. "I believe you will find these in order, Chairman," she said, her voice triumphant. Representing a clear majority, Mr. Carmichael slowly, methodically examined the proxies. The silence in the room was taut. Lydia tapped her pen impatiently, a smug smirk playing on her lips. Henderson fidgeted, but his expression was one of hopeful greed. Finally, Mr. Carmichael cleared his throat. "Indeed, Mrs. Thorne," Lydia had, with unseemly haste, adopted Damien Trent's surname during their brief, ill-fated association, a detail I privately savored for its current irony. "These proxies do represent a significant number of shares," Lydia beamed. "However," Mr. Carmichael continued, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on me, "there is one other significant shareholder block to be accounted for. A private investment trust which has, as of this morning, registered its holdings and voting rights. This trust, I am informed, now holds a controlling interest in Sterling Enterprises." A confused murmur ran through Lydia's assembled allies. Lydia herself looked momentarily perplexed, then annoyed, as if this were some minor bureaucratic hiccup. "Well," she demanded, "whose trust is it? Some offshore entity Henderson missed?" Mr. Carmichael's gaze remained fixed on me, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "The trust is named the Elara Vance Heritage Trust," he announced, his voice clear and firm. "And its sole trustee and beneficiary exercising full voting rights for 52% of Sterling Enterprises is Miss Elara Vance." Every head in the room swiveled towards me. Lydia's jaw literally dropped. The color drained from her face, leaving her power-red suit looking garish against her suddenly pallid skin. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, locked onto mine. I offered a small, polite smile. The same kind of innocent smile I had practiced for years, but this time it held the glint of finely honed steel. Before Lydia could find her voice, a distinguished looking woman seated quietly beside me, whom no one had paid much attention to, rose. "Allow me to introduce myself," she said, her voice calm and authoritative. "I am Ms. Anya Sharma, legal counsel for the Alara Vance Heritage Trust and for Miss Vance personally." Lydia stared, dumbfounded. Henderson looked as if he might faint. Ms. Sharma continued smoothly. "As Mr. Carmichael has stated, Miss Vance, through her trust, now holds the controlling interest in Sterling Enterprises. This position was achieved through the careful and entirely legal acquisition of shares over the past 5 years." She gestured towards me. "Miss Vance's maternal grandmother, the late Annalise Dubois, established a modest but independent trust for her granddaughter many years ago. A trust, I might add, that seems to have been consistently overlooked in previous estate evaluations." A pointed look at a sputtering Henderson. "Through prudent and, if I may say, remarkably astute anonymous investments made with the initial capital from that trust, investments guided by Miss Vance's own surprisingly keen financial insights, its value has grown exponentially." My naive questions to Henderson, my childish interest in financial magazines, my quiet hours spent reading, all recontextualized in a single, stunning moment. My outward passivity had been a carefully maintained shield behind which I had been patiently, meticulously accumulating power. The small allowance Lydia had given me, the gifts she'd bestowed, almost every spare penny had been funneled into this secret war chest. Ms. Sharma delivered the final, devastating blow. "Therefore," she concluded, her voice crisp, "any motions for a change in board leadership proposed by Mrs. Lydia Thorne or any other minority shareholder are, regrettably, moot." I finally spoke, my voice quiet but carrying in the suddenly silent room. "As the majority shareholder," I said, meeting Lydia's stunned, furious gaze directly, "I will be voting to retain the current board members in their entirety. Furthermore, I will be taking a far more active role in the company's future direction, effective immediately." I let that sink in, watching the dawning horror spread across Lydia's face as the full implications of my words hit her. "And our first order of business," I added, my voice hardening almost imperceptibly, "will be to commission a complete, independent, and forensic audit of all financial activities and transactions overseen by Mrs. Thorne and Mr. Henderson during their association with Sterling Enterprises and any related family accounts." The power in the room had not just shifted, it had undergone a seismic reversal. The girl Lydia had dismissed, betrayed, and tried to destroy was now, undeniably, her boss. And judgment was coming. The days following the shareholder meeting were a blur of frenetic activity for Sterling Enterprises and a slow, agonizing implosion for Lydia. Ms. Sharma, true to my instructions, had unleashed a team of forensic accountants who were now tearing through years of Lydia's financial machinations. The preliminary findings were, as I had known they would be, damning. Stripped of her access to company funds, her credit lines frozen, and her social circle rapidly evaporating as whispers of impropriety turned into shouts, Lydia was a shadow of her former self. She found me a few days later in the drawing room, a place she had once dominated with her vibrant presence, now looking small and diminished against the grand tapestries. Her designer clothes were impeccably clean, but seemed to hang on her slightly as if she'd lost weight. Her eyes, usually bright with calculation, were now hollow, tinged with a desperate fear. The ever-present scent of Jardin Interdit was faint, almost undetectable, overpowered by the musty aroma of old books and beeswax polish, the true scent of the house reasserting itself. "Elara," she began, her voice raspy, a pale imitation of its former confident timbre. She wrung her hands, a gesture I'd never seen from her before. "We need to talk. This audit, it's all a dreadful misunderstanding." I remained seated by the window, a book resting unread in my lap, my outward demeanor one of calm attentiveness. "I raised you, Elara," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "After your father, I was the only one you had. Everything I did, every decision I made, it was only ever to protect you, to ensure you had the best, to secure your future. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they looked genuine, born of pure, unadulterated panic. I met her gaze, my own clear and steady. The years of practiced calm, of hidden resolve, now formed an unshakable shield. You wanted what was best for yourself, Lydia, I stated, my voice quiet but firm, cutting through her desperate monologue. In this life, I paused, letting the words hang in the air. And in the last. A flicker of something unreadable, confusion, then a dawning, terrified recognition crossed her face. You remember the illness I had when I was 19? I continued, my voice even, almost conversational, yet each word was a precisely aimed dart. The one that left me too weak to question the documents you had me sign? The doctors could never quite diagnose it, could they? A slow, cumulative poison is difficult to detect, especially when the administrator is so attentive. Lydia recoiled as if struck, her hand flying to her mouth. I don't know what you mean. Oh, I think you do, I said, my gaze unwavering. I remember the crushing debt from Mr. Henderson's unfortunate investments. I remember you selling off my mother's jewelry, piece by piece, claiming it was to cover expenses. And I remember, with perfect clarity, Lydia, the terrified look on your chauffeur's face just before his car slammed into mine on that ridiculous hairpin turn on Mulholland. He was a pawn, like so many others you used and discarded. Her feigned tears vanished, replaced by a stark, bone-chilling terror. Her face, already pale, became ashen. The unspoken truth of my impossible knowledge, the reality of my rebirth, and the memories I carried finally crashed down upon her. This wasn't just an unexpectedly clever stepdaughter outmaneuvering her. This was something far more uncanny, far more damning. You can't, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It's not possible. And yet, I said softly, here we are. At that precise moment, as if summoned by the sheer weight of dramatic inevitability, Ms. Sharma was shown into the drawing room by our impassive butler. She carried a slim, leather-bound valise. Good afternoon, Miss Vance, Mrs. Thorne, Ms. Sharma said, her tone professional and cool. She placed the valise on the antique coffee table between us. The preliminary findings of the forensic audit are complete. The evidence of large-scale embezzlement, fraudulent conveyances, and conspiracy to defraud, primarily orchestrated by Mrs. Thorne with the active participation of Mr. Alastair Henderson, is unequivocal and overwhelming. She opened the valise and laid out a few key documents, summaries filled with damning figures and traced transactions. Lydia stared at them, her eyes wide with a trapped animal's fear. The authorities will, of course, be very interested in these findings, Ms. Sharma continued. A criminal prosecution, given the scale and nature of the fraud, would undoubtedly result in a significant custodial sentence for all involved. Lydia made a small, choking sound. However, Ms. Sharma said, her gaze shifting to me briefly before returning to Lydia, Miss Vance, in her considerable magnanimity, is prepared to offer an alternative to immediate criminal referral. She produced another set of documents, these bound in a plain blue cover. This is a full and final settlement agreement, Ms. Sharma explained. In essence, Mrs. Thorne, you will sign over all remaining personal assets, this house, which is legally in Miss Vance's name, but which you have treated as your own, any art, jewelry, bank accounts, everything of tangible value, to a newly established charitable trust. This trust, here Ms. Sharma allowed herself the faintest of smiles, will be dedicated to compensating the victims of your and Mr. Henderson's various financial schemes over the years. Miss Vance felt it was only appropriate that those you defrauded should be made whole from the proceeds of your ill-gotten gains. This was my final perfect twist. Not just ruin, but restitution, orchestrated from the very assets Lydia had stolen or coveted. You will cooperate fully in the recovery of all assets, Ms. Sharma stated. You will make a full confession, implicating all co-conspirators. In return, criminal charges directly relating to Miss Vance's inheritance will be held in abeyance, provided full compliance. Lydia stared at the documents, then at the pen Ms. Sharma calmly placed beside them. This was it, the moment the title of my reborn life was made manifest. She would, quite literally, sign her own financial ruin and, in doing so, fund the healing of others she had harmed. Her shoulders slumped. The fight, the arrogance, the years of careful scheming all seemed to drain out of her, leaving an empty, broken shell. She looked at me one last time, her eyes pleading, a desperate final gamble. "Elara, please," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "There must be something, some other way. I'm your stepmother. I loved your father." The air in the room was heavy with the weight of past betrayals, of lives ruined and trust shattered. I met her gaze, my expression devoid of hatred, devoid of triumph. Only a profound, weary finality. "No, Lydia," I said, my voice calm, unwavering. "There isn't. You made your choices in this life and the last. Now you live with them." A single tear traced a path through her expensive makeup. Her hand trembled as she reached for the pen. With a defeated, gasping sob that seemed to wrench itself from the depths of her soul, she signed each page where Ms. Sharma indicated. The scratch of the pen on paper was the only sound. Ms. Sharma meticulously collected the signed documents. The heavy oak door closing behind her as she departed felt like the final, definitive closing of a dark, suffocating chapter of my life. The aftermath was swift and brutal for Lydia. News of her spectacular downfall, the sheer scale of her deception, and the ironic justice of her assets funding a victim's trust became a sensation in the financial papers and gossip columns. Her name was mud. Her social circle, once so fawning, now shunned her with a viciousness reserved for the truly disgraced. Mr. Henderson, implicated by Lydia's confession, faced his own legal ruin, his career and reputation destroyed. Lydia was left with nothing but a small, court-mandated allowance and a notoriety that would follow her for the rest of her days. The justice was comprehensive, unambiguous, and deeply, profoundly cathartic. As the dust settled, I felt a profound sense of release, as if a heavy shroud I hadn't even fully realized I was carrying had finally been lifted. The scars of betrayal, once so raw and agonizing, were beginning to fade, replaced by the quiet strength of survival and the deep satisfaction of justice not just sought, but meticulously, comprehensively achieved. 2 years slid by, not in a rush, but with the steady, reassuring rhythm of a life rebuilt on solid ground. The gray clouds of my past had finally parted, revealing a horizon bright with possibility. I stood in the bustling innovation hub of Sterling Enterprises, the scent of fresh paint from a recent expansion mingling with the aroma of brewing coffee and the quiet hum of productive energy. The company, once a stagnant relic Lydia had sought to plunder, was now thriving. Under the guidance of the loyal board I'd retained and with my active, informed input, we'd pivoted towards ethical investments, sustainable technologies, and fostering genuine talent. Mr. Carmichael, his eyes crinkling with pleasure, was beside me, reviewing the schematics for a new employee profit-sharing initiative I'd championed. "Your father would be incredibly proud, Elara," he said, his voice warm. "You've not only saved his legacy, you've made it better, more principled." A quiet sense of purpose filled me, a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun streaming through the large windows. My focus was no longer on breaking down, but on building up. A future, a company, a life defined by integrity rather than retribution. Later that week, while reviewing quarterly financial summaries in my office, an office that was bright and modern, a deliberate contrast to the oppressive gloom of my father's old study, my eye caught a small, legally mandated notification buried in the appendices of a trust report. It was a brief update on Lydia's ongoing bankruptcy proceedings. The report mentioned her current address, a cramped, rented bedsit in a rundown part of the city. It spoke of her complete financial desolation, her name now a mere footnote in the ledgers she once manipulated with such arrogance. There was no flicker of triumph in me, no surge of vengeful satisfaction. Just a detached acknowledgement, like reading about a distant storm that had long since passed, its power utterly spent. Her chapter was definitively, irrevocably closed. That weekend, I drove up to Mirror Lake. The small cottage, my mother's cottage, stood peacefully amidst the whispering pines, now officially protected by the historical preservation order I'd secretly orchestrated. No developers had laid a hand on it. Its rustic charm remained untouched, a quiet sanctuary. I sat on the old wooden porch swing, the gentle creak a familiar lullaby. I was no longer the vengeful ghost of my past self, nor the naive girl Lydia had so easily preyed upon. The journey had been a crucible. I remembered the cold rage that had fueled my initial days, the meticulous calculations, the moments of profound weariness and doubt. But overlaying it all now was a sense of empowerment, a deep understanding of my own resilience. The scars of betrayal were still there, faint lines etched onto my soul, but they were no longer sources of pain. Instead, they were reminders of battles fought and won, of strength discovered in the deepest adversity. True strength, I'd learned, wasn't just about outmaneuvering enemies. It was about having the courage to rebuild, to choose integrity, to forge a life that was truly my own. Mrs. Gable, her kind face wreathed in smiles, emerged from the cottage carrying a tray with a steaming teapot and her famous lemon scones, a taste of true, uncomplicated affection. I'd sought her out not long after Lydia's downfall, offering her a position not just as my personal assistant, but as a trusted confidant, a link to the happier memories of my childhood. "Thought you might be getting chilly, dear," she said, her presence a comforting warmth. We chatted easily about my upcoming university courses in ethical business management and sustainable development, about a planned trip to Scotland with a small group of genuine friends, friends I'd made carefully, people who valued me for who I was, not for my name or my wealth. The profound isolation that had been a necessary burden during my years of planning had given way to authentic, carefully chosen connections. There was a lightness in my chest, a genuine smile that reached my eyes without effort. The next morning, I awoke before dawn. Wrapping myself in a soft wool blanket, I went back out to the porch of the little cottage. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Mist lay like a soft veil over Mirror Lake, the water still and dark. Then, slowly, tentatively, the first rays of sunlight broke over the distant hills. Hues of soft rose, then vibrant orange and gold, painted the sky, chasing away the lingering shadows. The light touched the surface of the lake, transforming it into a shimmering sheet of liquid gold. I watched the sunrise, a quiet sense of peace settling deep within me. This was my new dawn, a future I had meticulously, justly, and painstakingly crafted for myself from the ashes of betrayal. It was a future free from the shadows of the past, filled not with the echoes of revenge, but with the quiet promise of hope, of purpose, and of a peace I had finally, truly earned. The sun climbed higher, bathing the world in its warm, unwavering light. And for the first time in what felt like 2 lifetimes, I felt completely, utterly free.